Well, thank you very much for that exceedingly generous introduction and the high expectations I now have to live up to. It is a great honour to join you here today. And I want to start by expressing my appreciation for the great work that you do. Your frontline work in housing really does make a difference. I should also add that I am not a housing expert, you are. But I would like today to offer some ideas from a equality and beyond perspective for your consideration. And I expect that a lot of these ideas are probably ideas you've already thought about and perhaps even putting into practice, but I offer them again anyway. Some of these ideas may or may not be directly relevant to the work you do, but hopefully they'll give you some food for thought and be potentially adaptable to the work you're doing. So my starting point is that equality is not enough. Equal rights in housing or any other area of social policy is laudable, but it doesn't go far enough. So can I explain? When we campaign for equal rights, we're not basically questioning the status quo, but merely seeking equality within it. We are, in effect, striving for equality within what is, not questioning it, not challenging it. Even though what is often falls short of what could or should be. Even though it falls short of what is needed for a truly fair and just society. In other words, equality is premised on the idea of accepting the premise and parameters of what currently prevails and merely striving for equal treatment within that framework, even if it might be flawed and deficient. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, equality is important. We can all agree on that. But I don't think it's always adequate. Inequality is unfair and unjust. Equal rights is obviously preferable and morally desirable and superior. But, I repeat again, mere equality within society as it is, given that this society is deeply flawed and unjust in many ways, then going for equality alone is an implied collusion with that injustice. So my plea is for a more skeptical, questioning attitude towards society as it is. And I say that as someone who's campaigned for equal rights myself and who believes that equal rights is important and believes that getting equal treatment does make a positive difference. But I just want to go to a further, more far-reaching agenda beyond equality, an agenda for equality plus, for equality plus social transformation rather than settling for equal rights within what exists. So how is this relevant to housing? Well, I'm sure all of you are very much involved in striving to secure equal opportunities in housing, and that is entirely commendable. Ending discrimination and unequal outcomes in housing policy and provision is clearly a good thing and indeed a priority. Discrimination based upon income, race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, age, gender identity, and so on, these are not conducive to a fair and cohesive society. Now, although great strides have been made in terms of equal opportunities in housing policy and provision, as you well know and you've discussed today, much more remains to be done. It is true that there is formal legal equality. We've got a whole raft of equality laws that have progressively repealed and abolished discrimination and given people proactive protection against such discrimination. But in addition, there is what we might call the de facto informal levels of inequality, not written into any policy, not in any law, not even intended, but things that happen that result in unequal treatment or unequal outcomes. I join with those who say that the whole overall framework of housing policy and its funding is inadequate. It's not just about equal rights, it's about the whole framework in terms of policy and funding. And so what's needed to address everyone's housing needs is a fundamental restructuring and transformation of the housing agenda. Yes, I repeat again, we do need housing equality, but we also need a deeper systemic change in housing priorities and the way they're delivered. This means, among other things, better funding to build the 1 million+ new homes needed to address the housing shortage, and a commitment to higher building standards in terms of materials, space, energy efficiency, and so on. Plus, very importantly, affordability, both in terms of rents and in terms of house prices. You will know far better than me what is needed for a genuinely transformative housing policy. Clearly, it is not just about equal opportunities in housing, important though they are. We also need to go further to end disadvantage in housing across the board, and to do this requires a major commitment and investment, not just in equal rights. Delivering good quality housing at affordable rents and prices won't happen if we rely upon equal treatment alone. The resources are not there. They're not there because of conscious central and local government decisions to put funding elsewhere and to not devise a tax system that can raise the necessary revenue to make that good quality, affordable, mass available housing. Poor housing cannot be explained away as simply being due to a lack of equal opportunities. Although, as I've said, that is an important and indeed a contributing factor. It's also linked to cuts in the rates of tax for high income earners, the existence of tax havens and tax avoidance schemes, both of which deprive government of funds needed for housing investment. Many of you will see the research which shows that if tax avoidance loopholes and tax havens were closed, billions and billions more could be available for social programs. On top of this are the central government imposed restrictions on what local councils can do and indeed on their funding. The way in which local authorities have been over the decades so constrained and controlled about their options, particularly in housing fields, does provide or result in a factor that causes much of the housing problems we face. And there's also, of course, the fact that the government chooses to put its revenue elsewhere. The government makes a choice about where it spends its money. We always seem to find money to fight foreign wars, to subsidize rich farmers, to buy a new generation of Trident nuclear missiles, to fund high-speed to rail network, and so on. Whatever you think about those different policies, that is where a lot of money is going, which means there's less money available for housing. So it's often about priorities, and housing frequently seems to be under-prioritized by government. The attitude seems to be, in many cases, leave it to the market and the private sector, that they will fix the residual problems. Well, that clearly has not worked, is not working, and will not work. There are, it's true, certain specific equality issues the housing policy does need to address better. We know that there are tenants who are victims of racist, homophobic, or anti-Muslim abuse. So the interface between housing and equality and diversity issues is very, very clear. There's also the issue of housing, of tenants who are victims of sexual or physical violence, and the limited options that often they have. There are tenants who don't have adequate adaptations for their disabilities. There are tenants or would-be tenants who are ex-offenders and newly released from prison, who often have great difficulty in getting rehoused, end up in hostels and mix with other ex-offenders, which can often sometimes lead them back to a life of crime. So class and social income are perhaps the biggest neglected dimensions of the equal opportunities landscape. When we talk about equal opportunities, we usually think about gender and race, sexuality, and so on. But I would say class and social income are up there, and perhaps even the most significant of all. If we look at black and ethnic minority communities, they have the double whammy of racism plus, in many cases, social deprivation, low incomes, and so on. We know that we can't look at race or class, income, disability, and so on in isolation. These are all interconnected. Class and social income do cut across an impact on race, gender, disability, and so on. So I think there's a very strong case for mandating a socioeconomic duty on local authorities, governments, housing providers under the Equality Act to ensure that they, and indeed housing associations and private housing construction firms, fulfill certain minimum obligations in terms of addressing housing issues. And it strikes me that some kind of mandatory statutory obligation is probably necessary, because right now the voluntary system is not delivering. Of course, there are some statutory requirements already, but I don't think sufficient to deal with these issues. Issues which are endemic and systemic failings. You can't fix the system if we don't have a really coherent, robust approach, which does mean, in many instances, or in some instances, statutory obligations as well. I think of where I live in southeast London, in Elephant and Castle. It's a really classic example of what's gone so badly wrong with housing policy, and it's been replicated by many local authorities all across the country. Adjacent to the estate where I live was the Haygate estate, one of the biggest council housing estates in Britain. It had 1,200 flats, council houses, over a 25-acre site. The Labour government tried to push for redevelopment, nothing much happened. The Labour Council tried to push for redevelopment, not much happened. And then a few years ago, surprise, surprise, they signed an agreement with Lend-Lease to redevelop the site. Their own housing advisors said that to refurbish those flats, to bring them up to standard, to solve the social problems involved, would require a total of £65 million. But the estate was viable with that spending. The quality of the housing would be completely up to modern standards. But the local Labour Council disagreed. It rejected that and instead signed a deal with Lend-Lease. It sold those 25 acres, 1.4 miles from the Houses of Parliament, for £50 million, and then gave Lend-Lease a clean-up bonus of £15 million to cleanse the site. So they got it for £35 million. 25 acres, 1.4 miles from the Houses of Parliament, right next to the Northern Line and Bakerloo Line train stations and the big Elephant and Castle shopping centre. At around the same time, a private developer sold less than 1 acre for £40 million to private developers. Under the new scheme, the 1,200 flats, council flats, are being replaced by over 3,000 new apartments. Guess how many are social housing? None of them are council housing, but there are social housing. Out of 3,000 plus flats, 82 are social housing. And this was after the Labour Council promised that 35% of the properties in the new development would be affordable. Well, when you look at the sale prices, a one-bedroom flat is nearly £600,000. So that whole community of well over 3,000 people who lived on that estate have been forced out all over the place. Some have stayed not too far away in the area, but some have been forced out to Essex, Kent, even the north of England. I think it really shows what's going badly wrong. And as I said, this is being replicated by, sadly, mostly Labour councils all over the country. It's happening in Newham. It was going to happen in Haringey. As you know, the council that prior to the election was committed to a similar deal with Lend-Lease. Thankfully for local people, those councillors were voted out or not selected, and that scheme is not going ahead. But similar schemes are going ahead in many other parts of the country. So I just give you that as an example of how I can see that you can have great equal opportunities policies, but if the policy directives and the policies signed up to do not reflect the interests and needs of local people, then those policies count for nothing. You can bet that the majority of local, low-income, working-class people who live in the area are not going to get a flat on that new estate, either now or in the future. And you can bet that given that black and ethnic minority people tend to have higher levels of low income, that they will be particularly adversely affected. So just to finish, I'd say that what really is needed is, as I said, some kind of clear statutory codification of what affordable rents are, what affordable house prices are, and the requirement that a certain percentage of these are built into every new housing contract and development. In other words, to transform housing policy rather than merely secure equal rights within it. Thank you.